Thank you. A few weeks ago, I was at the Book Lovers Ball. It's a gala fundraiser for the Toronto Public Library. And as I was there, I was looking around at the items at the silent auction. And I saw across the room a celebrity author that I knew from grade 7. It's just that that author was the one that brought an adult book on a camping trip in grade 7. Now, I can tell you, every scout in our tent knew about that book. And I can tell you we were hard in our pajamas, in our sleeping bags, when the book started to be read. It's just that these were scouts and they weren't necessarily good readers. And the book was losing a lot in its presentation. And there had to be a reason for me to be in the tent. Everyone knew I was a good reader. If there had been a badge for reading, I would have had it. The book was given to me, and I just have to say right now that the problem was, when I learned to read, it was with, word recognition skills. So I read, and I gave it my all. I threw in drama, passion. She raked his back with her nails and screamed in organism. My friend who brought the book, he was the one who shouted out, "Orgasm, you idiot! Orgasm!" And I think that's when the scoutmaster came in and confiscated the book. That was my first experience of someone taking away reading material. Well, as I grew up, I became a page at the Bendale Library in the Scarborough Public Library. And I started working right about the time Xavier Hollander moved to Toronto and published that infamous book, The Happy Hooker. And I think the library had decided that the best way to circulate that book, they were not censoring. They were going to circulate it in a brown paper bag. But since it was the only book being circulated in a brown paper bag, it made it pretty clear who was borrowing it. And I always remember this man came in and he was returning the book and he saw the sign for the adult book club. And he said, "Oh, I'd like to join that." He thought the adult book club would be more of the same. He was most disappointed when he got next month's reading, which was Jane Austen's Northanger Abbey. He decided not to join. But it was when I worked at the library that I truly did know that that's where censorship was fought. But even at the library, there were problems. Because I know that when the book Forever by Judy Blume came out, some of you may have read it. It was a big book. It was her first book for teens. And the first line goes something like this, that Sybil Davidson had a genius IQ and she had laid at least 6 guys in the last year. Clearly there were problems with this book. But the library had it. The library had lots of copies. I worked in the interloan department. And it was just in that department that there was someone who decided that this was an inappropriate book for teens. Teens that had submitted a request to read that book waited months and months and months. The reason? Quite simply, someone on staff called in all copies of the book and destroyed them one by one. Now, it has a happy ending. More copies were bought. But clearly, even in the library, one has to fight censorship. And years later, when The Joy of Lesbian Sex came out, it sat in the cataloging department for at first months, and then years, because none of the women in cataloging wanted to have that book on their desk. Indeed, again, the book was finally put into the collection when someone discovered that it was still sitting back in the stacks. Now, by the time that book came out, I was also working in the adult department of the library, and I was buying the collection. And I remembered that the issue with that book, when the book Lesbian Nuns came out, I thought we're getting it. We are absolutely getting Lesbian Nuns. And so we bought lots of copies. And I remember the difficulty in explaining to someone that I insisted that we buy this book, Lesbian Nuns. And her only response was, "Who would want to read that? Let's be nuns?" I can tell you, though, the book did circulate well. But while I worked in the library, my true passion was in children's services, so I was a children's librarian, and I was the children's coordinator in the Scarborough Public Library, and then became the children's advocate at the Toronto Public Library. And it was when I first started that I realized that censorship is a tricky issue. For there was a book in the teen browsing section, and it was called Sex, Love, and the Believing Boy. So, always interested in sex, I picked it up and started reading. And I was surprised that we had a book that talked about homosexuals being pitied, that this was truly a disgusting lifestyle, that masturbation was something to be abhorred. And the worst person of all was the bisexual, because they were simply having sex to gratify their perverted desires with anybody. So I thought, okay, the library has to provide both points of view. Where do I stand on this book? And it was tricky, I have to say, because I thought, if I had been 11, if I had been 13 and picked up this book, would have been hard. So I did what a good librarian does, and I moved it from the browsing section to the religion section. Now, I can tell you, that book is still in the Toronto Public Library. I looked it up this morning. And I was delighted to see that it's in the reference library in closed stacks. But it was when I decided, having worked in children's services, I defended books all the time. The Devil in the Drain by Daniel Pinkwater. A mother was afraid that all children would be afraid to have a bath after reading this book, a very simple book. Another complained about It's Perfectly True, an Andersen fairy tale. And their complaint was it had an image of a chicken that had been plucked. After the story of the chicken had been told, it gets killed, it's plucked, and she knew that her child would be upset. I sort of thought a trip to Loblaws might also upset the child, but we dealt with it. And I was lucky as a book reviewer, because I was lucky enough to be on the children's book panel on CBC with Peter Zosky, and I remember talking about a book, The Waiting Dog. And when the publisher found out that I was going to talk about the book, The Waiting Dog, they must have let some other people know. And a bookseller called me and said, "Don't talk about that book. We don't stock it. It's a terrible book. It's too violent for children." And I thought, wow, it's really hard. A book can be written, and then the booksellers decide that it's too violent and children won't get the chance to read it. The libraries bought it, and I made my point clear when I talked about it on the radio that it was a perfect book for a kid in grade 4, not a picture book for a younger child. And that's one of the problems with censorship with children, is there's different ages where something is appropriate and something isn't. But then I decided that I wanted to write. And a good friend of mine, I had helped her scatter her husband's ashes underneath the Lillian H. Smith Library, actually. And it was Joan Bodger, who was one of Toronto's great storytellers. And I wanted to honor her with a story, so I wrote this story, and I sent it to the publisher that I admired the most. And I sent it to Patsy Aldana. Now, I'm not saying this is censorship, but Patsy did say to me, Ken, we don't do ashes in picture books. And she didn't. But why I truly admire Patsy is she liked the story enough to publish it in an anthology of why libraries are important, even as a burial spot. But as I continued writing, I started with a few fairy tales and retelling. And then I realized when I was working on The Wild Swans, which is a story that you may know of the Brothers Grimm, Anderson has it. There are many versions of this story. But in one scene, the young princess who's collecting nettles has to go into a cemetery. And when she goes into the cemetery, in all the old versions, she's met with witches who are digging up graves, pulling out bodies, sitting on the tombstones, and chewing the limbs of these bodies. And I thought, do I want to do that in a book? And I thought, is a publisher going to take it? And so I left that out. And when I was asked to write Mom and Mum Are Getting Married, it was interesting. I knew as a children's librarian that I had to have a story that anyone who was picking it up knew exactly what it was about. There couldn't be any surprises in this, and clearly the title gives the story away. It was a really simple story, and I was glad it was published. And at first it was censored. Well, it was challenged by the printer in China who wouldn't print the book, and that made for good publicity. And let me tell you, the publisher was great. They sent it to every politician across, well, in Ottawa, and some responded, and many didn't. But it was when I was signing books at Book Expo America that it dawned on me how difficult this book was for some people. Because the book was free. People were having it given to them, and I'd sign. People did come to actually get the books. They wanted to meet me. They wanted me to sign the book. But there were other people, when they handed them the book, they just looked at it and said no and gave it back. It was just that when I saw this elderly woman with white hair, and she came up and they gave her a book, and I thought, oh God, I just don't need somebody saying something to me right now. And she came over and she said, I just want to say thank you, because my brother's a Lutheran minister in the Midwest, and his daughter's a lesbian, and she and her partner have a child. And there's nothing in his congregation that supports him. But he knows he loves this child, and he loves his daughter, and this book is going to help him. And so here I was thinking she was going to complain, and support comes from the strangest places. And my next book, which is coming out, has been a challenge for both me and my publisher, because I'm writing a book. It'll be out in a couple of months. It's the men who were persecuted in the Holocaust for being gay. And it was a topic that I knew about, but I knew when working in the library and talking to young gay men that they didn't even know what the pink triangle stood for. And I thought, we've got lots of information about the Holocaust, but we have so little information about these men. And it being for teens made it more challenging, because it is about sex and it is a violent book. And I had to listen to the publisher. She was warning me about making the book too violent. And yet I wanted the book to be really hard-hitting. It took a lot of work on both our parts. And I'd say compromise was difficult. But I'm glad that I went through it, and I realized that some of the scenes that were taken out may have been too graphic. But I also wonder if there aren't kids who are reading that want more, and they're going to have to do more research to find it. It's an interesting process working on nonfiction. And what I can say simply to close, the author that I met at the Book Lovers Ball, well, I wonder if that book that he brought made him a better reader and writer. I don't know. But it certainly had an impact on me. And what can I say? Of those 8 horny little boys in a tent, 2 of them ended up writers. Thank you.